So we are in some ways still in the same series, but also entering a new part in this series that we've been going through for a while. If you remember, we've been talking about the idea of who we are, and now we're going on to the idea of what we are. So we're still talking about what the church is about and all it is that we need to be doing, but we're kind of shifting gears a little bit about how we're looking at those things. We've already understood who we are and who we're supposed to be, and so now we have to start to shift to understand what that means, what all of that is about. And as we go through this series, we're going to kind of do it a little bit differently. Instead of just speaking about different ideas, characteristic traits, or whatever you want to talk about, we're actually going to be looking at these different phrases relating to the tabernacle. And so we're going to be looking at not even just the tabernacle itself, but really the story surrounding how it came into being. Now, on the one hand, it makes sense to call this what we are because we are, in a sense, the tabernacle of God. If we are the temple of God, and the tabernacle was, in essence, the very first version of that, then we as the church, all of us together, become that tabernacle of God. So that's a part of it, but there's also a lot of stuff in that story in general that really helps us begin to understand what it is that we really should be all about when it comes to God. The whole idea, as we'll even see a little bit in this sermon itself, of what's actually happening in that idea of the tabernacle is that the people as a whole are actually coming together. To me, I've always liked to use it as a great story and understanding of the unity that the church is supposed to have. That the way that the people functions in getting the tabernacle set up and going really shows how that can actually look. And so we're going to kind of be talking a little bit about that, but most specifically, we're talking about you are blessed to be a blessing. And as we go through this, hopefully you'll begin to understand and see what that actually looks like. And so when it comes to the tabernacle, the idea of what we're looking at here is giving for the tabernacle. And there's a few passages throughout this section that kind of speak to that and show what was happening when it came to this whole story. But in order to understand what's actually happening here, you have to go back a little bit further. You have to go back to when the people are actually coming out of Egypt to understand how it's even possible for them to do this in the first place. And right as they're leaving Egypt, we find this phrasing where it says, "Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses. They had asked from the Egyptians for articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians." And so we see that God was already beginning to set this thing up. That if you really look at it, these Israelites, they had been slaves for so many years, and they didn't have anything. They weren't able to get at least not much for themselves because they were so busy working and doing all these other stuff. And so what they did was God set this thing up where they asked from the Egyptians for these things, and because God gave the Israelites favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and basically because at this point the Egyptians just wanted them gone so they didn't have to deal with the plagues any longer, they gave them all of these different things. It says to the point where they actually plundered the Egyptians. It's like the idea of they captured them in a sense like from the inside out, that they didn't come in and take them out, but because of what God had set up, it had that same effect to the point where Egypt really became nothing for a long period of time after this, that they weren't the great power they were because of this idea. And so God ultimately provided for them so that they could provide what it took to make his dwelling place. And so this is where it starts. It starts in the story of the Exodus where the people are coming out and they are able to receive all of these things. This is the idea of being blessed. This is the first part of what this sermon is about, is that God provided them with these things. It wasn't as if the people just got all this stuff for themselves. They didn't make it, but God actually provided them for it. And again, really, in general, we see that throughout the entire story of the people of Israel, that God was always providing for them. But he was the one who provided for them beforehand, before they probably even knew what in the world they were doing. He already set up this place where they actually had the ability to make the tabernacle that he was going to tell them to make, because of what happened as they were coming out of Egypt. And so we have to keep that in mind as we begin to get into the first part of this story of what is actually happening here. And so it says, "And Moses spoke to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, saying, This is the thing which the Lord has commanded, saying, Take from among you a contribution to the Lord. Whoever is of a willing heart, let him bring it as a contribution to the Lord. Gold, silver, and bronze, and blue, purple, and scarlet material, fine linen, goat hair, and ram skins dyed red, and porpoise skins, and acacia wood, and oil for lighting, and spices for the anointing oil, and for the fragrant incense, and onyx stones, and setting stones for the ephod, and for the breastplate." And so he begins to give them this list of different things that they needed to make the tabernacle and be able for the priesthood and everything to be able to function the way that it was supposed to. And we see that many of these things that the people already had from what they had gotten out of Egypt. We would assume that they probably had in some ways accumulated some of this other stuff, or was around them where they were at, or something of that nature. That God's not just asking these people to go and figure this stuff out on their own. He provided it for them so that they were able to do it. And we see through this, it becomes the responsibility not of the priests and the people who were going to be using or even making this stuff, but it becomes all of the people had a part to play in this. And so that's part of what is happening here, is that God is calling all of the people to be participating in this. But specifically from this, we can learn that having something leads to an expectation to give. And we see this played out in the New Testament in the book of Ephesians, where Paul is telling the people not to steal any longer, but to actually do something with their own hands so that they have something to give. It's for the purpose of actually being able to give. It's not just making money for your own self, but it's actually being able to help out and provide for others in the process. And similarly speaking, that giving comes from a willing heart. And again, we see that talked about in the New Testament as well, that when Paul is talking about this idea of giving, he describes it as actually being from a heart that truly desires to do it. And you see that when Moses is asking the people for this, he says basically whoever is led to be doing this, that it's by the leading that they do that. And so again, it's not, there is an expectation to it, but it's not in the same way as, being such an obligation that you have no other choice. It was still a choice to be made, but the fact that they had these things, there's still an expectation that comes with it. But it still has to be out of their own heart that they choose to do it. And basically, it seems like the idea is that as they see that they have all this stuff, that they likely had an overabundance of stuff they probably didn't really need or have much of a use for, they could see that, well, this makes sense to be able to give this to the tabernacle. But obviously, it still comes with a cost. But we also see that God provided it for them in the first place. And so this isn't some major burden on them, but yet at the same time, it still does ultimately cost them having to choose to give it up. And so this really sets the foundation for what we see and how all of this takes place, is that the setting up of all of this is the fact that people have all of this stuff, and it can ultimately lead them to be able to give what they have because they already see this. And then what we see next is the response and what actually happens. It says, "Then all the congregation of the sons of Israel went out from Moses' presence. And everyone whose heart stirred him, and everyone whose spirit was willing, came and brought the contribution to the Lord for the work of the tent of meeting, and for its service, and for the holy garments." So again, we see that everyone whose heart stirred and everyone whose spirit was willing, that the ones who actually wanted to do this were the ones who participated and gave out of what they had. Then all whose hearts were willing, both men and women, came and brought brooches and earrings and signet rings and bracelets, all articles of gold. So did every man who waved it as a wave offering of gold to the Lord. And every man who had in his possession blue and purple and scarlet material and fine linen and goat's hair and ram skins dyed red and porpoise skins brought them. Everyone who could raise up a contribution of silver and bronze brought the contribution to the Lord. And every man who had in his possession acacia wood for any work of the service brought it. All the women wise at heart spun with their hands and brought what they had spun in blue and purple and scarlet material and in fine linen. And all the women whose heart stirred with wisdom spun the goat's hair, and the rulers brought the onyx stones and the stones for setting for the ephod and for the breastplate, and the spice and the oil for the light, and for the anointing oil and the fragrant incense. The sons of Israel, all the men and women whose heart was willing to bring material for all the work which the Lord had commanded through the hand of Moses to do, brought a freewill offering to the Lord. So again, it repeatedly states the fact that their hearts were stirred, but at the very end, it makes this point of the free will offering, that this was not something that the people had to do. There were plenty of offerings and sacrifices they had to make. There were daily ones that the priest did for all the nation. There were ones for sins or for other purifications that the people had to do as they had a need of it. But these free will offerings were ones that people just brought to the Lord just because they wanted to do something. It was something different than the rest of the sacrifices and offerings that were required under the Old Testament system. And so that's what we see happening here. Again, these are not requirements, but still, we still see that idea that there was that expectation because they had this stuff, they should be doing it. But the ultimate point that we see from here is that giving is not compulsory nor an obligation, but out of one's heart toward the Lord. And so, again, it might get a little bit confusing to understand how this works, but the idea is that there is this expectation when you have stuff to give, but at the same time, it's not because you're giving, not because you have to, but because your heart actually desires it. And that's how we have to begin to look at this, that's how they needed to understand what was happening there, but it's also what we can truly take from this is that, again, go back to the title of this, if we are blessed to be a blessing, we have to recognize that if we are blessed, then that blessing part to others has to follow along at some point. There's this struggle with speaking about giving money in churches in general because some people take advantage of it and use it as a way of forcing people to do it. And that's not the point of it, but yet at the same time, people still need to have an understanding that there is some kind of an expectation of them doing it. And again, it's hard to communicate that in many ways, and so that's why people sometimes avoid it or go too far with it because it's hard to communicate both realities, that doing it out of an obligation is not really helpful or good for you, but yet there is still this expectation that comes along with it. And that expectation is simply because you have something to give, and so you should want to be able to give it. And again, obviously, God's the one who helps change our hearts to get to that point, but we have to have some kind of an understanding of it as well. And so really what this comes down to is as they kept giving, we find this happens at the end of it. And they received from Moses the entire contribution which the sons of Israel had brought to do the work and the service of the sanctuary. And they still continued bringing to him freewill offerings every morning. And all the wise men who were doing all the work of the sanctuary came, each from the work which he was doing, and they said to Moses, the people are bringing much more than enough for the service of the work which the Lord commanded us to do. So Moses commanded, and a proclamation was passed throughout the camp, saying, let no man or woman any longer do the work for the contributions of the sanctuary. Thus the people were restrained from bringing any more. Indeed, the material they had was sufficient and more than enough for all the work to do it. And so, as they kept bringing these free will offerings, as they kept bringing as their hearts gave to them, they brought so much that there was more than what was actually needed to do the work. Again, it wasn't as if they were trying to build an entire city, they were trying to build a tabernacle, which again was, a tent that had a limited amount of stuff that was needed for it. And so as they kept bringing this stuff, it got to the point where, well, there was enough to complete it, and so they no longer needed to keep bringing. And so we see this idea that when everyone is participating and giving to the kingdom, it will be more than enough to accomplish the purpose. The problem that usually exists is that there are not enough people actually wanting to do this, that there's not enough people actually participating in the process of giving, and so there's not always enough to go around. And that's the biggest struggle, is that when you have a few people doing the vast majority of it, they either become too burdened with it or no longer able to do it, or it's just not enough when it comes down to it. But when you get everyone participating in it, it actually changes things. It's kind of similar to the same ideas that many people come to church to try to get something out of it. But what the Bible actually teaches is we're actually supposed to come with something to give to one another, basically to be encouraging one another. And the reality is if everyone's actually doing that, you're going to receive something in the process. The problem is that we often go after seeking that rather than just allowing it to come back to us. And so when everyone is participating in something, it makes things work the way that they're supposed to. People don't have to seek after or get drawn into things that aren't important. Everyone's just participating, and the overflow allows everyone to be blessed in the process. And so I think that's kind of what we can take and learn from the story, is that as people took what they had, what they were able to give, it became so much that they didn't need to keep doing it. But we have to get to this point where this is actually happening. Otherwise, things just always get left behind. But I think to kind of help sum this up and kind of bring it back down to where we can begin to understand how this relates to us, we find the parable of the talents in the New Testament that kind of relates to this idea. It speaks about a man who's about to go away for a period of time, and he leaves some of his servants with different amounts of talents. I can't remember the exact numbers. I think he gives one 5, and he gives another 2, and then he gives the last one 1. And the one with 5 went and doubled that, so that he had 10 talents. The one with 2 went and doubled his, so that he had 4, while the one with 1 went and just dug a hole and hid it there until his master came back. And when the master comes back, he gets to the one who had the 1, and he gets upset with him. He tells him that at the very least he should have gone and put it into a bank so that he could have gotten interest from it, rather than just sitting in a hole and accomplishing nothing. But the whole point of what the parable is about is it basically tells these two things, is that if you can't do much with little, then how are you going to be able to do much with a lot? And it tells the story that if we have something, basically it's the point of what we are given, we need to actually do something with it. And how we are able to handle, again, little also determines how we can handle a lot. But it leads to this point that everything that we do with our resources should be for benefiting God and his kingdom. And that's kind of the point of what we see with that parable, is that when the one with 5 and the one with 2 actually use what they were given, they were able to benefit from that. They were able to use it to get more out of it, so that they could give back to their master what they had, more than what they had just been given, because they actually used that to accomplish something. And again, ultimately it comes down to this idea that since we are blessed, we must be a blessing to God and others. And that's what happens in the story of the tabernacle. God blessed them so that they could bless God with the place to dwell among them, but it also blessed the people around them. And this is where we see the fact that the tithes and offerings that came in were to benefit the priests and Levites who were working in this place. They were given a few cities, and so they basically had really nothing for themselves. They were dependent upon the people and those offerings and the things that were brought in to provide for them. That though those things were in essence given to God, they were given to God for the purpose of blessing the people who were serving him in there. And so this kind of parallels the idea of what is happening within churches today. That's the part of the reason why people give, is to support the leaders within that church so that they can do the jobs that they're able to do. That they're giving up being able to work a job and get the money for themselves, so they need to be in some way supported by the people to whom they are serving throughout the weeks. That they are given, in essence, their full-time job to ministry. And so that's part of the reason for it. But we also have to understand that if we have been blessed with a building, then we also ought to be taking care of it and actually keeping it and using it to be able to function. So there are other costs that go along with that. And so there are reasons why we must give and help support the churches that we are at. That, again, it comes down to this whole idea that if we are blessed, then we need to be a blessing to others. And again, that works in a whole bunch of different ways, because really what happened when you get to the New Testament times is that they were, in essence, kind of giving to a church for the sake where the church could then take those resources and use them. It wasn't about giving to the church as much as it was about pooling the resources in one place so that it could then be decided how people needed it, that those who had need within the community most specifically could then receive it as that need became known to the leaders there. And so, again, it wasn't as much about giving to a church as we think, as much about putting the resources in one place so that they could be used to the best of the knowledge of those ones who basically actually had knowledge of the needs. And so, again, all of those three different ideas are how we can get what we have today in the churches, is that, again, there's buildings and other things that need to be done that the church uses to function. There are leaders who need to be compensated for what they give. And there is money that goes out to other places for people who have need, whether it's within that community or even outside of the church, but within the community that they serve. That all of those things become a part of how churches function and use their money. And so we must give in that sense so that we can actually provide for those things. And again, all of this comes back to that whole point of, if you are blessed, then you must be a blessing with what you have been given. That many people try to take the parable of the talents and misunderstand the word talent and think it means what we have been given from God that we're able to do, but the word was actually reference to money itself. And again, to them, back in the ancient cultures, they didn't think as much about money even as they thought about resources and property and what a person owned as being, in a sense, their money. So it's with all of our resources, with everything we have, that we're supposed to give to God. And so, yes, that includes our time and our, what we would call our talents and all that other stuff, but it still at some point comes down to the fact that we do have to use the idea of money and giving to the church if we're going to accomplish all of these different things. And the struggle that we have at a smaller church like this is you get a few people doing the majority of it, and it becomes a burden on them, and many people just kind of, in a sense, get by with just receiving from the church without giving to help it out. And obviously, we understand not everyone can give a whole bunch of money, and that's not what we're asking. But what we have to understand is that if all of us are giving, even if it's a little, it can go a lot longer and a lot farther than you think it might be doing. And so this really becomes a part of what it means to be a follower of Christ, is that we have to actually look out for the people who are around us. And so, again, those different ways that I described are ways we can do that, and through giving to the church, it can accomplish that. Doesn't mean that's where even all your money has to go when it comes to giving. You can give to other causes and other things as well, but some of it still needs to come to the place where you are seeking to serve. And again, the more you get involved in the church, the more you realize how much money is needed to accomplish those things. And so if maybe you're struggling, maybe you just need to get involved more to be able to see the need and to see what even some of the money is actually going toward. But what we have to understand from this is that what we are as followers of Christ is blessed by God. Even if it's not financially, we are still blessed by God in so many ways. And so we need to bless God back and then be a blessing to others as well.